Welcome, everyone. My name is Ross Jordan. I'm the curatorial manager of the Jane Addams Whole House Museum. The Jane Addams Whole House Museum is located on the campus of the campus of the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the museum draws upon the legacy of international peace activist, suffragist, and feminist Jane Addams, and the other social reformers who lived and worked alongside their immigrant neighbors to expand democracy on the near west side of Chicago. The museum connects the histories of the Whole House sentiment to present-day social justice issues. I want to welcome everyone to our third of our Museum and Social Justice program series, presented in partnership with the Museum and Exhibition Studies program at the University of Illinois, Chicago. The Museum and Social Justice series explores the creative potential of museums to facilitate social change and champion issues that serve the common good. Jane Addams Whole House Museum has been at the forefront of rethinking and transforming museums and museum practice. And the issues of museum and social justice feel just as relevant today as ever before. In 2020, more museums than ever before are trying to address social issues, and the public are demanding more of their museum institutions. This summer, we saw public activity that removed and defaced symbols that uphold racism and racist ideology. When asked what should be done with Confederate monuments that weren't thrown in rivers or ended up in rivers, then candidate, now President-elect Joe Biden said, "I think they belong in museums." The logic being that these statues inside museums become teaching tools for visiting school trips and interesting subjects of dissertations. What is not good enough for a public square may be good enough for a museum. In 1968 congressional hearing on the perspective of building a museum to African-American history and culture on the Washington Mall, writer James Baldwin, when asked what were the stumbling blocks in creating such a museum, he replied, "The Black experience in this country does indicate something about the total history of American history, which frightens Americans." So how do museums talk about what frightens us about ourselves, and how do museums share stories about those that are on the side of justice and social change? Tonight we will hear from agitators and educators working inside and outside of museums, pushing them to address neglected histories, marginalized populations, and embrace their role as cultural stewards that can make change. We have lots of questions for our panelists tonight, but we'll also have Q&A, so please use the chat and the Q&A if you're joining us on Zoom, and use the comment function on Facebook Live to hear from us there. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can, both online and off. Right now, I'm going to introduce Anthony Scepter, who's going to be helping us introduce our main speaker tonight and our other great panelists. Anthony Scepter is the Assistant Director of the Museum and Exhibition Studies graduate program at the University of Illinois. He holds a master's in visual and critical studies from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Anthony has curated exhibitions and projects for ACRE, the Washington Park Arts Incubator at the University of Chicago, and the Critical Distance Center for Curators in Toronto, among other sites. He served as a juror for Apex Arts, collaborated with the Office of Public Culture in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and most relevantly to the kind of conversations we're having tonight. Anthony co-curated Extinct Entities, a months-long performance series of commissioned artworks exploring the history of Chicago-based art spaces that no longer exist. I'm going to welcome Anthony Scepter in to join the conversation and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ross. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Scepter. I am the Assistant Director of the Museum and Exhibition Studies program at UIC, as Ross said. Thank you so much to all of you who are in attendance. It's great to see, you get to see that there are a lot of people here. There's over 40 people already joining us tonight. We've got a bunch of great panelists, so I will be help with introductions and helping facilitate the Q&A. So you're going to hear a lot of reminders to use the little Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom and send us questions, and I will help make sure we try to answer as many of those as possible. We're going to jump right into it. And so I'm going to introduce the first presenter, which is Therese Quinn, who is the Director of Museum and Exhibition Studies at UIC. Therese has worked as an exhibit designer, researcher, developer, evaluator for the Field Museum here in Chicago, the California Academy of California Academy of the Sciences, and other cultural institutions. She's received tons of awards, including funding and awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Fulbright Awards, and is an elected and active member representative of her faculty union. Therese is also a founding member of the Illinois Deaths in Custody Project, a really fantastic project, which maybe I'll drop the link in the chat. And of course, as is the occasion for tonight's conversation, Therese has published numerous books, articles, and other writings widely, including in the Journal of Museum Education, the Monthly Review, an independent socialist magazine, The Abolitionist, and Rethinking Schools. Therese and I get to work together, and I am so happy that you all get to share in her brilliance tonight. So I am going to wrap up this introduction and say welcome to Therese Quinn.
Thanks, Anthony. Hi, everybody. Already had my first technical glitch, of course. This time it wasn't unmuting, but unvideoing. Forget it. You know what I'm saying. I'm going to share my screen, but first I wanted to say thank you to Ross for that really great introduction. First of all, any introduction that cites James Baldwin is already brilliant. And the fact that Ross described us all on the panel today as educators and agitators, I love that so much. I'm just going to claim that right now. So now I'm going to share my screen. My charge tonight is to offer a brief introduction to my book. I had the both fortune and misfortune to publish a book in 2020, right at the top of the pandemic. So I haven't really had enough chances to talk about this and also to get feedback on the book from people. And so I'm hoping to get that from you all today. And I'm really excited about having a discussion about the ideas that I'm sharing in it. In a nutshell, the book really is my attempt to stand in solidarity, both with public school teachers and workers in public museums. I think both of these sites, public education and public cultural sites, are sites of tension and possibility. And I think in the tension and possibility, there's always a chance to learn something. And so I've tried to create a platform through this book of ideas and some resources to help springboard learning and work in alignment with social movements for justice. So that was really my goal. So now I'll jump into the images. So the book is called School: Questions about Museums, Culture, and Justice to Explore in Your Classroom. I'm not trying with this book to provide a packaged curriculum because I fully believe that teachers know how to teach their specific students best. But I also know that teachers are really busy and don't always have time to look for the particular resources, and sometimes can benefit from a little help putting the ideas together just so that they can make it happen a little quicker in their classrooms. So when I think about museums, and I think maybe many of us have at least some of this in our minds, museums as places where children can tour fragrant botanical gardens, they can watch beetles clean carcasses in natural history museums, and they learn about baby chicks, such as at the Museum of Science and Industry, and how they hatch, and search for family records in neighborhood historical societies. And these are all wonderful moments for young people. And in this way, this part of museums makes me think that there's lots to love about museums. But unfortunately, museums are also disappointing. They often charge admission, often quite high. They're frequently located in difficult to reach places, as in the city of Chicago. There's a bus that gets you there, but if you want to drive, it's very expensive to park. And they feature usually in the United States, English only labels and programs and all, other materials, making it difficult to access the content. And last, they often employ guards and docents to control how visitors can use their spaces. For all these reasons, museums can be alienating places for people who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, queer, poor, and members of other marginalized groups. So tonight we are going to hear some great examples of work in museums that connects to social justice, including one of a project in which a teacher and students organized for cultural justice and Latinx representation in a museum in our city, or city of Chicago. And so in my book, I've tried to point out that this kind of activism or agitation has a really rich history. The oldest museum of Black art and culture in the US, the DeSable Museum, which was first called the Ebony Museum, was started in Chicago in 1961 by Margaret Burroughs. Helen Valdez co-founded the National Museum of Mexican Art, the only accredited Latino museum in the United States, in 1982. And in 1998, Peggy Montez started Chicago's Bronzeville Children's Museum, the first and only African-American children's museum in the United States. These origin stories, which are also stories of struggle, agitation, and education for all of these women and the other co-founders, were educators as well as cultural workers. But these origin stories are not as well known as they should be. They are actually, in my view, the foundational stories of museums, and should be included in museum studies. And for that matter, while Europe and the US are both often credited with the creation of the first museums or the first public museums, the oldest museum known was founded in the 6th century BCE by a woman named Enigaldi Nana in what is now Iraq. Now, I didn't know this story until a student of mine who is from Oman said that this is the history that they teach in the Middle East, of course. They don't teach that the origins of museums were in the US and Europe. So this is the oldest museum, and this is another story that we should know more about. And as I mentioned earlier, teachers know how to reach their students, but they are busy. So with that in mind, this book doesn't offer, as I mentioned, scripted lessons, but instead it poses questions, identifies some themes, like this question and a theme here on this slide, and describes projects and offers resources for educators who are interested in museums as storehouses of culture and history that can be tapped to support school-based learning and also to teach for social justice. So in the book, I offer examples of museum work that supports social movements, like this postcard, and suggest that teachers and students investigate and talk back to their museums. And in fact, they could use this postcard, just copy this wholesale to speak back to the content that they see. Exploring why museums have collected, in the book, I also suggest ways for teachers and students to probe the meanings of discovery. What does that really mean? Also ownership and authority and science. And I also suggest using the great film Black Panther as one tool. And the book centers indigenous science because Native peoples have always gathered, observed, and tested as ways of learning about the world. We also collect to remember and celebrate. So I included this image because I love this exhibit honoring Chicago's first Black mayor, Harold Washington, which included his Cadillac, as you see here, in a hallway in the Washington Elementary School here in Chicago. I think that building a classroom collection or a school collection like this is a great project. One history can be overpowered and swallowed up by another. Locating the origins of museums in Europe rather than the Middle East is one example of that. Revealing what was hidden and challenging what seems common sense are important aspects of decolonization, a process of identifying and remedying the damage that was caused by settlers. Decolonization requires action. The goal is to unsettle, but first we have to know where we are and where we are not. Celebrating participation, another chapter in the book, suggests ways to explore how public spaces can become fully open and accessible, specifically addressing disability rights and liberation. Queer Crip artist Sky Cubicub calls for radical visibility. Queer and Crip are names that are used to, quote, shake things up and jolt people out of their everyday understandings of bodies and minds, of normalcy and deviance. Rejecting the idea of normal is good for people, and it should be an ethical stance for museums. It would also really change museum practice and how they look. Amanda Caccia, a curator with dwarfism, says that access should be viewed as a creative tool, not a practical afterthought. These stairs, which are also a ramp, as you can see, and beautiful design, are a result of that kind of approach. Increasingly, museums have been urged to accept that they are not neutral institutions. They always have a point of view, and they also have power that they can use. It's common for museums to acknowledge the wealthy and the famous, as I'm sure we've all observed, but poet Jan Henry Gray, who was born in the Philippines and immigrated to the US at age 6, imagines museums that instead honor the people, often immigrants, who keep things running: maids, nannies, drivers, and nursing home attendants. He imagines a maid museum. Museums could also mobilize their power to address urgent issues. For example, Chicago has a 50-year history of police torture. A local newspaper broke this story in 1990, and it was covered repeatedly over the decades. In 2014, an activist group from Chicago called We Charge Genocide took the story, a report about this history, to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, and the United Nations heard and agreed there's this history. They said that there should be some action. In 2015, finally, Chicago approved a $5.5 million fund for reparations and became the first municipal government to approve compensating police torture victims, and also mandated a curriculum telling this history in all Chicago's public schools. Despite ample documentation and the remarkable successes of these organizers, the city's major museums, as represented in this 2019 screenshot of the Chicago History Museum's website, have almost completely avoided mentioning the topic. In fact, I'm unaware of any museum in the city addressing our history of police torture at all. But this story is a good springboard for discussion, and it could be a foundation for a class project and other histories like this. They're the vital histories that we all need to know about. Another chapter in the book suggests that museums should celebrate lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and cultures. And I don't mean just represent, I mean celebrate for the contributions to culture of LGBT people. So this museum in San Francisco created what they called Hand-Holding Day, and they invited couples and thruples of all sorts to come and hold hands in the museum, feeling safety and welcome. And they also invited visitors to the museum to hold hands with this famous queer couple, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. So I think that's a good example of celebration there. And artist Chris E. Vargas founded MATHA, or the Museum of Transgender History and Art. While most museums unfortunately lag in centering the stories of queer people and movements, they offer many entry points for reimagining social norms. These include reimagining design, as in this picture. What would it take to have a bathroom for all of us, or to create a museum more basically that welcomes all of us in all the ways we need to be welcomed? So that's just one example. We could also, or any museum could also, explore the theme of chosen family. What does that mean? That's a queer contribution to the world that should be celebrated and taken up. So those are just two examples of that, how museums could do that and how teachers could teach to those ideas. Students and teachers can help shape the future that we all deserve by critiquing museums, is kind of my fundamental point in this book. For instance, why not resist curation? I know the curators out there will have something to say about this, but in my experience, curation is almost always a top-down, kind of a hierarchical solo vision endeavor. And I'm suggesting that instead, we should be focusing on creating exhibits through collaborative and shared meaning making. So the book links this idea to civil rights organizer Ella Baker's insight that strong people don't need strong leaders. How can all the activities that we engage in together create us all as strong leaders? How can we all be content creators? And what would that mean about how we create exhibits? And sort of by extension, what does the traditional form of curation foster? So I think my bottom line question with this book is, are museums there yet? Are they worthy of us? And unfortunately, my answer is no, but I think that's why they are actually such great platforms for teaching and supporting the long work of social change. They're not perfect, they're vexed places, but because of that, they're wonderful places for teaching. And with that, I will conclude and thank you all for this. And I hope people have some thoughts and some critiques. I had to leave a lot out of my presentation here. I also have a section on what's not so great about working in museums. They don't pay very well for one thing, but they are amazing places in many other ways. So I would like to hear responses, and I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Therese. I'm going to now introduce the next presenter tonight. The next presenter is Nancy Villafranca Guzman, who is the Vice President for Education and Engagement at the Chicago History Museum. Previously, Nancy was the Chicago Office Director for the Inter-University Program for Latino Research. And before that, she was the Education Director at the National Museum of Mexican Art here in Chicago for almost 10 years. Nancy also taught social sciences and humanities in 2 different Chicago public schools. Nancy recently completed a second master's degree in Museum and Exhibition Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So we are so happy to welcome Nancy to tonight's presentation.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you so much, actually, to you, Ross and Therese, for just inviting me to be part of this conversation today. I am also going to share my screen in a little bit. If you can bear with me. Okay. Okay, so I would like to start actually just my brief presentation with a little bit of background on some of our new programs.
Nancy, we lost sound.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. The last thing I heard was a little bit of background.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I did get notice that my internet is unstable, so I will just try to get rid of my screen, but share. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. I'll keep going. All right. So yeah, I wanted to tell you that in the last few years at the Chicago History Museum, we've had a tremendous opportunity to center social justice and cultural responsiveness into our education programs. 2 years ago, we received funding to launch our K-12 School Partnerships Initiative and actually run it side by side our on-site school programs. So prior to this initiative, which has now come to be called the Chicago Learning Collaborative, we were doing well with student visits, and this included field trips and workshops and hands-on learning carts and self-guided exploration, curriculum for the classroom, and teacher professional development. We also had an active teacher advisory board, and the programs had strong attendance, but their development, implementation, and evaluation did not yet center equity and who we were reaching and how and where, and participation did not necessarily reflect the diversity of our city. So in the past, a lot of the programming that we were doing reflected the exhibitions, their themes, and the way the museum has been interpreting our collection for a long time. These inform the workshops, the teacher professional development, and learning resources. But as the museum also began to have conversations about equity and inclusion in our exhibitions and collecting practices, in the education department, we've had more flexibility to go beyond the exhibitions and collections and to begin building a curricular framework that was more inclusive and culturally relevant in a way that our exhibitions may not be able to quickly change or adapt to. A lot of this work takes years and sometimes decades, as those of you who work in museums will know, but in museum education, we can be a lot more responsive in our approaches. And that is exactly, where we started, trying to define our educational approach to programs and resources. We obviously, as a Chicago museum, we know that the content will always be on Chicago, but we wanted to build our programs in a more collaborative, relevant, and responsive manner. Our first audience in this initiative were our bilingual, not only, was it a large percentage of the student population of Chicago public schools that was of Latinx background and also English language learners. We were not explicitly serving them at the museum or in their classrooms. So the first program called Chicago Literacies, we focused on supporting bilingual literacy instruction and critical thinking and learning about other communities that have shaped Chicago beyond the dominant narrative and through social studies concept of challenge, choice, and change. The pilot curriculum was influenced by the work of Dr. Barbara Radner and from the former Center for Urban Education at DePaul University, and focused on literacy, critical thinking, pilot, and hearing from teachers directly about how students responded to the resources and the bilingual readings that we included. We need to focus on neighborhood history and center cultural responsiveness in our approach. We knew right away that this was going to be about a lot more than just translating text and about sharing the history that was personally meaningful to the students and motivated them to just want to learn more. With this major shift, we formally launched the program 2 years ago, thanks to the incredible work led by fellow UIC alum Liliana Macias. The curriculum keeps growing and including many more stories about neighborhoods and communities not typically part of the mainstream narrative, including stories about Indigenous Chicago, past and present, neighborhoods, community activism, racial segregation and inequity, Chicago women, and different forms of resistance and resilience from communities that have faced many challenges. The Chicago Literacies program is currently in more than 10 schools every year and reaches multiple educators in each school and in grades 3 to 5. The program includes sessions and curricular resources that can be used throughout the year. These include bilingual readings, archival and collection. The program also includes in-classroom workshops, parent workshops in the schools, and a culminating family day at the museum. And we believe that one of the many reasons why this program gathers support and continuous funding is because of its responsiveness to educators and students and the way that it integrates their feedback. In these past 2 years, and thanks to the ongoing feedback and evaluation, we've made some changes. We now partner with teaching artists to lead workshops in student classrooms where students further affirm their family and community history through art projects and center themselves as future history makers in their own communities, beginning to also build civic awareness. We've updated our field trip experience to better reflect the learning in the classroom, even if it is to point out what is not there in our own exhibitions. We changed the parent workshop delivery format to more visual approach since we learned that parents had varying degrees of literacy themselves. The gallery engagement during Family Day is now co-led by bilingual college students and artists who help interpret the content in our exhibitions in either language and includes culturally relevant performances too. We now collaborate with participating teachers over the summer to add to the curriculum by contributing lesson plans and unit plans to share with other teachers. And some of the teachers are now part of our teacher advisory board and helping making it more diverse. We're aligning curriculum design for the program into our internship and fellowship opportunities and are about to begin forming a diverse community review committee to further ensure scholars from the communities we are representing in our curriculum are included and co-creating with us, especially as Indigenous community history has been left out of so many museum conversations. So now that this program is established, we're about to launch 2 more programs this year. This includes Chicago Artivism and Chicago Inquiries, both of which have a civic arc. Obviously, this has been more challenging to run during a pandemic. We're committed to the work. And after these programs are formalized, our next challenge will be to integrate and sustain the programs as part of our operation and no longer as a separate initiative. No longer side by side our current programs, but the programs that we center. This work is gradually becoming the core of what we do and providing the structure we need to be responsive all the time. This work would not have been possible without building relationships with educators and hiring staff that come from the communities we're trying to represent and reach. However, However, as much as we have flexibility as social justice and DE&I becomes a lens through which the entire museum will operate. And this is where input and collaborative, social justice work with urgency and providing validity, collective input, and community allyships. As a Latina who worked in a Mexican art museum that centered and embraced my history and identity, and now working in a museum whose permanent exhibition has only one object that represents my culture, not even my history, I am aware of the work that needs to be done. When we heard from a group of young Latinx activists from a school just a few blocks from where I grew up in Pilsen, demanding Latinx history in the museum, it became a turning point for me personally, also very emotional moment, but also it was important for the rest of the museum. And thanks to this youth and community activism, change in the museum will now go beyond education and impact exhibitions and our collection, hopefully helping us redefine the way we collaborate with diverse communities to have inclusive collection in addition to exhibition programs. Okay. Hopefully you were able to listen and see. I understood my connection was unstable in and out throughout the presentation, but I'll stop right here, and then Anthony, you can hand it over to our next presenter.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. That was really wonderful. And I can't wait to jump into the conversation, the broader conversation with everyone else. So next, I'm going to introduce the next presenter. Anton Miglietta grew up in the community of Uptown from 1978 to today. While working as a community and youth organizer, Anton received his undergraduate degree from Northeastern Illinois University and completed his master's at Chicago State University. He taught at alternative schools for 10 years, including a position as the social justice curriculum coordinator at Rudy Lozano Leadership Academy. Anton co-authored Urban Renewal or Urban Removal, a grassroots look at Chicago's land grabs and the struggle for home and community, published in 2012, as well as the Grassroots Curriculum Toolkit. Back in the classroom since 2016, Anton let me know that he is honored to support his students in centering Latinx history in specific and people's histories in general at the Chicago History Museum and throughout Chicago schools. So welcome, Anton. And Anton will also be joined by a number of students who I think, Anton, you'll introduce them to us?
Definitely.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us. Therese, thank you for the groundbreaking work and always being on the cutting edge in these scholarly areas and community and art areas. Thank you so much. It's my honor to actually present really quickly Jair Ramirez. You may see his name as DA on the screen. Jair and Asia, if you guys want to unmute and feel free to show your video or not. At our school, we have a rule that students get to determine if they show their video or not. So certainly feel free to do that or not. But definitely you can unmute and jump in. So Jair Ramirez and Asia Owens are two students that have worked on this project. They actually, what's interesting is they weren't directly in that first class. They were in the school observing it and were always interested in it and just jumped in with it. So I really appreciate that about Jair and you, Asia. You guys have really saw from the beginning what was happening. And you guys are going to talk a little bit about it. I'll show the little, just a short little slideshow, just showing how we sort of went to the museum and came across this important work. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, looks like we can.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So we're at a school, Instituto Justice and Leadership Academy. It's about 99% Latinx, different communities and cultures within that. And so this was in a class of Chicago studies, and we decided the students, one of the ways they determined they wanted to learn, which I surveyed them in the beginning of the class, was field trips as one of the big things. And of course, who doesn't want to get out of school and go do something? So we decided to go to the Chicago History Museum first. We were studying DuSable at the time and the indigenous peoples of Chicago, and decided to go to the museum just to see how this museum treated the histories of communities of color. So we went there about a year ago. It was like late September. So we went there. We participated in a workshop that we wish had been run by Nancy and Liliana. But it was run by a few other people from the museum, and they were cool, but they were older and a little patronizing to the young folk. But luckily, our students are really mature. But Nancy, we would have loved you, of course, facilitating. So we learned a little bit about social justice from these wonderful facilitators, just a little patronizing to the students, but that was well taken care of by us. And then we examined the museum for Latinx history and for how DuSable's history was treated. And so the students began to search. And
yeah. They be,
Go ahead.
So I wasn't part of the class that went to the field trip with but I definitely heard about what happened at the field trip and what happened at the museum based upon like not only the pictures but from what all the students were saying afterwards.
Yeah.
And most of the stories were basically along the lines of like we didn't really find anything or little to any representation of like Latinx representation in the Chicago History Museum. And it's crazy to us because we're like, well, we've been part of this city since a minute. You feel me? It's been like couple decades since we've been a part of Chicago and influencing not only its society but its culture and what people even consider what Chicago and what a Chicagoan is. So when we went to it, we saw that the only piece of representation was something that wasn't even made in Chicago and wasn't a representation of what Chicago culture was, at least in Latin eyes, because lowriders and the lowrider culture is more for the West Coast and for California, and we're like, that's not from over here, That's very something that was very misrepresented, and that was most of what everybody was saying, and as you've seen from the pictures, there wasn't anything else to really see other than the lowrider.
Yep. And I think noticing that the students then, as Jair mentioned, they just started talking a lot. And so they, once they got really tired of searching and finding nothing on Latinx culture, they got tired, we got angry, and we walked to the lake. Luckily, North Avenue Beach is close by, and we strategized, right? So we said, let's just go cool off and let's strategize a little bit. And so students decided they wanted to bring attention to this. I had a different unit ready after this unit, but they said, no, we want to fight for our history in the Chicago History Museum. We want to be represented. And we're not going to let this slide. So they decided to make posters. They wrote letters, wrote powerful letters. And then they went on social media and they started doing petitioning. So these all became learning projects in and of themselves, because what teacher doesn't want their students to write? And what student, we mostly got tired of writing in school because it was always irrelevant, boring research papers on topics that maybe the teacher assigned. Well, these students were ready to write, and they wrote amazing letters. And so the skills of writing, of organizing, of petitioning, of generating art to draw attention to an issue, of speaking, of holding press conferences. These were all the skills, real world skills that emerged from this project. And they asked many people to jump on. Asia, now, do you want to mention sort of why you jumped in, and tell us a little bit about what you think about this?
Hi, my name's Asia Owens. I wasn't part of the field trip like Jair wasn't. Anton actually came to me with the project, and I really wanted to join because I wanted to make a change, and the times, the time that I've been to the Chicago Museum on my own, and I saw the same thing, like lowriders and stuff, and I feel like that's not, who we are as Chicago Hispanics. That was more of California style, and I think it's a really good opportunity for us high school students to make that type of change.
Yep, thank you for that, Asia. And then Jair, do you want to mention any of the maybe where we're at now in terms of working with the curator? And Asia, do you guys want to mention sort of where the project is at now?
Yeah.
Right now? Oh, go ahead.
Well, where we at is essentially, we're already having a focus question every week and curating and doing research on our own time and meeting with Brittany once a week about the focus question. And this week's focus question was like music that resonates to the Latinx community from the 60s and 80s. And well, me personally, I feel like a lot of the music that comes to mind is like a lot of like jazz, like very like Latin jazz and Latin salsa, and like Juan Sebastian comes to mind first and foremost, basically because he is from Chicago and grew, worked in Pilsen, and now is like a Mexican like icon. So that's, as far as I know, that's where we at. Does Asia want to talk about where she's at?
You want to add anything to what we're doing right now, Asia?
Well, yeah, like Jair said, like, we're looking right now, our question is about Latinx music and like that relates to them and their struggles from back then. And then last week we also had a question about, like historical events for Hispanics that came to Chicago. So I think that's like, we're on a good track by having a different question every week and meeting with Brittany every week. And then we meet as students, we meet on our own also. So I think that's really good.
That's right. And Brittany, they're referring to Brittany Hutchinson. She is the curator that was assigned to work with us to build the vision of a larger Latinx history exhibit. It's scheduled to be released in 3 years, and the students will be part of the curatorial process, the decision-making every step of the way. Part of our work here is to not only make sure that Latinx history is represented with dignity in the Chicago History Museum, but that also I think the students have spoken to never learning or nearly never learning any Latinx history in Chicago public schools, or any school for that matter, for their 12 years of schooling until they came to our social justice school, beyond maybe hearing of Cesar Chavez. We think this is criminal, that this is intellectual genocide. If students don't have a chance to learn who they are, where they come from, and what their power is, how can they ever gain that? So our fight is not just to change the museum, but is also to change the curriculum in the schools as well. And we are really excited and honored to be a part of this panel. And with that, Jair, Asia, is there any final comment?
Not really, Anton. You kind of really summarized it the way I memorized it.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
All right. Great. And we're excited to work with other students. That final point is that other students will be invited to be a part of building this exhibit, because our students, they have told me that they don't want to be the only ones. They want to make sure that other students are involved as well. So thank you so much. And that's our little story. And we'll hand it back to our wonderful host.
Thank you so much, Jair. Thank you so much, Asia. Thank you, Anton. Really appreciate you all sharing that story. And I personally super appreciate the work that y'all are doing. So moving on to our next presenter, Michael A. Ramirez is the educational manager at the Jane Addams Hull House Museum. Michael is an alumnus of UIC and began working at the Hull House as an undergraduate and has been with the museum for the past 9 years. Michael manages the museum education team and coordinates educational experiences for visitors, including tours for students and faculty at UIC, Chicago Public Schools, and the Chicagoland area. Michael coordinates a biannual day-long program of Girl Scout activities, all of which fuse Hull House history with educational strategy. Michael served on the panel of the 2012 STEM Pathways Conference, has been a guest lecturer for numerous UIC classes, and serves as a junior board member for project exploration. So thank you so much, Michael. I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you for joining us, everybody. And everyone who has spoken so far has been so amazing. So thank you for your work as well. So just to give everyone a really quick kind of where Hull House is at. I know that we had gotten a question about, what is the role of Settlement House historically. With the Jane Addams Hull House Museum and the Hull House settlement that started in 1889, this was a space that was really helping out the massive immigrant population that was coming here during the Industrial Revolution. And so throughout the 70+ year run of Hull House, they're helping out somewhere in like 10,000 people a week at the peak of its time in a 13 building complex. And the Hull House settlement really kickstarted the settlement house movement around the turn of the century, with people witnessing the success of what was happening in Chicago, what a group of women who deviated outside of the norm of what a woman was supposed to be, and working with like minds and other people who also didn't really fit into the mold. Historically, though, settlement houses, they were unfortunately seen as white-only spaces, which was something that Ida B. Wells actually questioned Jane Addams and her colleagues about, and wondering why there was not integration in those types of environments, which a lot of the workers had said, well, they thought that people would just come there no matter what. They didn't know that they had to do that outreach. So those have been some conversations that we've been diving into recently. But one conversation that I've been lucky to be a part of and help curate throughout the 9 years that I've been at the museum is the conversation revolving the LGBTQ population that has come throughout major cities like Chicago. And so this actually all started with myself and two past educators who identified as queer youth. And at the time that we started this, I was, in my early 20s and still trying to figure out kind of my own identity. But we were really lucky enough to create a gender and sexuality tour at our museum, which let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, there we go. And this was implemented in 2014, where we really wanted to see our own history come out at the museum. We as educators are, especially at museums, are in a unique space, right? Because not only are we trying to respond to our audiences, but we are also the audience, right? We're creating conversations and different exhibits for not only the people coming through our space, but also so that we feel proud working in whatever space we're in, so that we can see ourselves and really lend our own personal experiences to whatever we're teaching. And so that's something that myself and the many educators that we've had come through the museum throughout the years have really tried to position ourselves in, right? Figuring out how do we bring ourselves into this museum. So this really allowed me in particular to be able to do that. And it was diving into the history, right, struggles of many LGBTQ plus people throughout the years, and really kickstarting with Jane Addams and questioning her own identity and wondering about, was she a lesbian? And this all started with this portrait here of Mary Rozet Smith, which this conversation about her and Addams started in 2008. So prior to me being a part of the museum, but it was great to see that there was a small step being made to have these conversations as part of a well-known museum throughout the city. The then director at the time, Lisa Lee, was really questioning who this person was. And even at the time, these conversations were still kind of hush. Some people were very vocal about who she was to Adams, and some people were kind of reserved, not really saying much. But going through the archives and documents and finding out more about Mary Rozet Smith, she did find out that Smith was Adams's lifelong companion. So in 2010, this portrait, which is a massive portrait that we have, was hung up in Adams's bedroom and incorporated into everyday vernacular at the museum. So again, in 2014, when we implemented the gender and sexuality tours, the conversations of the LGBTQ plus community was much different than what we see today. Language was a lot different. So we were also trying to figure out what is a label that both respects Adams and Smith, but also one that people want to adopt, ones that they want to feel comfortable using. And so we at the museum decided to choose the term queer for Jane Addams and Mary Rozet Smith, which historically has been used as a derogatory term, right, meaning strange or unusual. But at the time, it was starting to be reclaimed more and more by the LGBTQ plus community as an umbrella term for those who sat outside of a stereotypical heteronormative relationship. And throughout the years, it's become a word that a lot more people have been more comfortable using, myself included. So that is still a term that we use at the museum today in, again, everyday vernacular. And that was also something that we really wanted to make sure, right? For a lot of museums, there is that struggle of wanting to incorporate these types of conversations, but also the struggle of it feeling a lot of times for the public as a one-off or as, well, we have to do this. And yes, we felt like we had to do this, but also we felt like we had to situate this as just everyday conversation for people. It didn't have to be something that was, a special topic that people had to, reserve to talk about, which was how the tours did start. But eventually it grew into, now on every tour, we talk about LGBTQ plus conversations and history. And we just feel like, with it being history, these are important pieces to have because, again, much like ourselves, it's important for the public to see themselves and who is coming into and who's being represented in public institutions. So throughout the years, we have been lucky to work with artists like Benji Hart in 2015 with his program Dance as Insurgent. We also were lucky enough to implement a children's reading corner, which incorporates some LGBTQ plus stories so that younger children can also start to see themselves if they might be thinking, of where they kind of situate themselves in the LGBTQ spectrum. Because as studies have come out throughout the years, kids younger and younger are, able to identify themselves in much different ways than previously thought. And we also incorporated these ideas into all of our family days. As was brought up earlier, the term chosen family, which was something that we loved to adopt because these family days are for any type of family, right? It doesn't have to be just a mom and dad and kids. It can be your friends, other people of like minds that you connect with, which was the whole idea of the settlement house, right? A space where Adams, other colleagues, men and women, were coming together and creating these strong bonds that really pushed forward these amazing ideas that really changed the landscape of how we operate today. So at the museum, we've felt really lucky to be able to, again, not only incorporate these stories, but expand on them and make them a everyday occurrence in our museum, especially because many of us on staff also identify somewhere along the spectrum. So we've been incorporating these and now looking more into LGBTQ plus identities and race and what that looks like. So every day we've been changing the conversation and lucky to have people like the people on our panel today also doing some similar work where we can start, cross-breeding our ideas and figuring out what do new conversations look like and what more people can we see represented in our museums. So with that being said, I know it was a lot of information, but I'm going to turn it back over to Anthony to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your work. And I'm always impressed. If someone can stay with a single institution for 9 years, that is an achievement in and of itself. And it's really wonderful to see how the work you've been doing there for all that time has evolved. So thank you for sharing. We have one more presenter tonight, one more panelist, Dr. Lucy Mensah, who I will introduce in a moment. And I will just say, I see folks are putting questions in the Q&A, and I want to just encourage you to do that. We'll get the Q&A started after Lucy's presentation. But if you all have a lot of great questions, just put them in there now, and we will make sure we get to as many of them as possible. So with that being said, Dr. Lucy Mensah is currently a visiting assistant professor of Museum and Exhibition Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's a graduate of Vanderbilt University, where she obtained her PhD in English with a focus on 20th century African-American literature and visual culture. Dr. Mensah holds a BA in English from Bucknell University and an MA in Cultural Studies from Carnegie Mellon University. She's held curatorial and research appointments at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., the Frist Museum in Nashville, Tennessee, and the Detroit Institute of Arts. And we are so fortunate to have Lucy here in Chicago with us and on the panel tonight. So thank you so much, Lucy. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anthony. And I'm setting my timer because everyone knows I like to talk a lot. Firstly, thank you, Ross and Therese, for allowing me to be a part of this panel. And it's a pleasure to also get to know the rest of the panelists who I'm sure we will be collaborators at some point. And I am also just happy to say that Therese's book is just a gem. So I really do encourage everyone to purchase a copy. And I think you will find it to be an amazing resource and repository for a whole host of conversations that are happening in the contemporary museum world. So what I've had the luxury of doing is I'm not actually presenting, but just responding. And it's been nice to take a back seat and actually just listen to what's going on, particularly in Chicago, and where I see Therese's fantastic book intersecting with the previous panelists' work. So I think a common storyline that I found going throughout all the presentations that I listened to was the idea of origin stories. And I really liked how, Therese, how you opened up your conversation with thinking about how might we tell the origin stories of museums differently, right? And it is not so much that, and I think this idea of decolonizing museums, and I think as you brilliantly remark in your book, is a verb, as you argue, right? It's an ongoing process that takes a collaborative effort to really reinstill in the museum its civic qualities and its ideals. So some of it is sort of forward moving, but then I think it seems to me that some of the work is also actually showing museums its own history and its possibility, right? I loved the idea of thinking about the museum as an imperfect institution, right? And although I think it can be oftentimes very stress-inducing, and museums can be a sort of very sort of culturally traumatizing place. I'm definitely of the camp of Jack Halberstam, for example, who says, there's an art in failure, right? Failure can be generative. And I'm really interested in how the pedagogical space, the classroom, becomes the way in which museums are sort of held up to a higher standard. Nancy, I love the work that you're doing at the Chicago History Museum. I think thinking about origin stories, I really liked toward the end where you were talking about your own situatedness in Chicago as a resident of Pilsen, right? And as a Latinx woman who has not seen herself presented, rightfully so, in museums such as the Chicago History Museum, right? And I think that it bears sort of reckoning and having these museums actually reckon, especially museums in Chicago, reckon with what actually is the history of Chicago, right? Which starts even, you know, before we get to Dusabu, right? It's and the indigenous tribes who used to reside in this space. So that goes back to thinking about what Therese said about the politics of telling one's origins. And I think if Chicago History Museum is presenting themselves as sort of this bastion, as this sort of monument to Chicago's history, then there has to be sort of this sort of plurality, and you commented so well on thinking about sort of the multiple sort of dimensions of literacy and how Chicago History Museum is sort of incorporating that in their space, and using the plurality of its city to sort of be the standard by which they create inclusive exhibitions. I only have 30 seconds. Okay, I'm going. Anton, it's a pleasure to also meet you as a fellow educator. I'm so happy to have, I'm glad that your students, Jair and Asia, were able to join the call. I think students make one of the best teachers. And I've always sort of thought of myself as being sort of a student as well in the space. And I think your projects sounded just so amazing to think about ways of using the genre of writing, using the pedagogical tool of sort of inquiry-based learning, and to sort of illuminate and investigate the museum as a space where, unfortunately, culture and history are often bifurcated, right? And I think what your students are doing so amazingly, Anton, is sort of forging the two back together again, and using anger and distress as a radical response. And then lastly, and I know I'm running out of time, I think it was just so amazing to also hear from you, Michael, in terms of what the Jane Hull House is doing. And going back to what Therese said about origin stories, and I think I'm gonna think about origin stories for some time. What if we started with the storyline of Jane Addams being sort of an example of what it would mean to sort of think about gender and sexuality in a radical way, right? And again, thinking about coming back to the truth and to the rightful origins of these spaces and the histories of these spaces, demands alternative and more radical ways of sort of imagining relationships and imagining sort of affiliations, and using this sort of radical history, this true history, right, of the settlement house, to then create exhibitions that are inclusive of people who belong to the LGBTQIA plus community, right? So I thank everyone for your presentations, and I've learned so much. I have a bunch of notes, but I look forward to hearing more conversation around these topics.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lucy, for bringing some connecting some of the threads, amazing and wonderful and thoughtful threads that were shared with us tonight. We've got some really fantastic questions in the Q&A. So if you all in the audience have other questions, please feel free to add some more. But we're gonna just jump right into some of the audience Q&A. So I'm gonna now invite the panelists and presenters, if they want to turn on their cameras. Again, it's up to you if you all want to do that. But why don't we start there? One of the first questions was a question actually for Jair and Asia. And the question asks, Jair and Asia, are there one or two pieces of Chicago Latinx history or exhibits that they strongly feel belong in the Chicago History Museum? Jair and Asia, are you all with us?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you hear the question? I can repeat it real quick.
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
No problem. Someone asked, are there one or two pieces of Chicago Latinx history or exhibits that you strongly feel belong in the Chicago History Museum?
I feel like Chicago's mural and graffiti movement, and I also feel like Chicago's gang culture should be in the Chicago's History Museum, because both have been influential not only in its like political sense but also in its pop culture sense. For example, King Von is a trending topic right now all over social media, and you know, he was a Chicago rapper who came from the South Side, you feel me? So it just goes to show you how, even though we look at these problems and we still look at them in a bad light, we still have people that are coming from those same situations and making the best out of it and still influencing the world around us, you feel me? So it goes to show you how, like, not only like are we a community that impacts Chicago, but we're a community that also impacts the world, you know? So I feel like those two would be the ones that I would be on the top of my list.
Wonderful. I love Jair just had an answer right away. Right away. Perfect. Asia, if you are here and want to answer, you're welcome to respond to that question as well.
Like Jair said, I agree with them too. I also think music and art is also some of the big things that we can focus on, because you know, besides, you know, yeah, they did, you know, a lot of times they did run to the streets and all that, but some of them, you know, they turn to graffiti and like art to like express their feelings, and music also.
Fantastic, wonderful answers. And I think I want to highlight something that Nancy mentioned in the chat, and maybe Nancy, you will tell us a little bit more about that, but you mentioned that the research that's happening is leading to an exhibition that will happen at the Chicago History Museum.
Yeah, I think Anton was alluding or referencing this, but you know, because of the work that they did last fall and the meetings that they organized, almost within a week or two, the museum pretty much added an exhibition to our exhibition schedule. So this would be a Latinx history exhibition in 2023. And so Brittany Hutchinson, who's the curator on behalf of the museum working on this, has been, you know, working with Anton and an advisory committee, and the, as you heard from Asia and Jair, they're already working and doing the research and meeting and becoming part of the curatorial team from this moment on. So lots of learning, as you were saying, Lucy, learning from students, and, you know, those of us who consider ourselves students, you know, lifelong students and lifelong learners, we're definitely learning and awe and seeing, I mean, how quickly they answered that, you know, like really confident and knowledgeable curators.
I think just to add to that, that the work really is really about decolonizing these institutions, these museums. And how do you really do that? Well, you have to challenge first of all, teachers have to be able to bring to their students real world learning and real world action. And then we call it inquiry based, we call it problem based, we call it social justice learning. There's all the terms for it, right? But the students are most excited to learn when they see that what they produce will actually hit the real world and make a real impact, right? And that's, and especially on a justice-centered function. When they went to the museum and they saw how empty it was of their own cultures, and yet there's hot dogs and there's Chicago Cubs and there's all this other stuff that is really irrelevant, but it is just white supremacy based. The comments that we have to call it out, and the students called it out. One of the leaders of the museum literally said that his priority, he said, well, this is going to be challenging because my priority, we have the Irish Americans, the Polish Americans, the Italian Americans, the German Americans, and the Jewish American communities all vying to be in the museum. And he told me this, right? So I said, okay, well, the students are definitely going to challenge that, right? So I think it's about bringing it to our students and letting them really respond in ways that are really meaningful.
Yeah, like to add on like what Anton said, like, well, obviously I wasn't part of that meeting, but like I get where he's coming from, like mentioning like all them other nationalities. But what about, there's mainly Hispanics and African Americans in Chicago. There's not a whole bunch of Germans and Jewish people. You don't, everybody that you see is Hispanic, African American, or other culture. You don't see that too much. So for him to focus just on that, I don't think is right. I think he should focus more on what nationalities that like are mainly in Chicago to make his exhibit more. I think by him doing that, more people will go and he'll make more money. Because I mean, I'm sure that's what it is to him, is money. So by him doing that, that gives us, it gives us more of a chance to go and he makes more bread. So
And
that's what we call critical analysis.
and my thing also is like, all right, cool. Who made hot dogs? What nationality is the Cubs owners? Who are mostly the people who played in the Cubs from the big, since the Cubs were established, you feel me, up until like the 1960s, you feel me? When like Jackie Robinson broke, the record of being the first black man in, Major League Baseball. You feel me? So it's kind of like, all right, bro, like I get what you're trying to say, but you also have to recognize all of the people that have been glamorized in your museum come from those nationalities. You feel me? Nobody in this museum looks like me. You feel me? And that ultimately is the real question. You feel me? And that's ultimately the biggest problem that I have, at least with the museum, is like, all right, cool, bro, but like, why can't you like at least have one hallway dedicated to people that look like me? You feel me? A small exhibition that can be dedicated for people that look like me and come from my neighborhood, you feel me? Because there's all of these other white people in here that resemble all of these other little white kids. But you feel me? I'm not represented, you feel me? Like when I was younger, I know that made me feel like shit, you feel me? And I know that made me feel like, oh damn, I don't like being brown. I don't like being who I am, you feel me? And that developed the early sense of depression, you feel me? So that's like, it labels down into like a very critical sense and a very critical thinking of a child. You feel me? That shouldn't be necessary. And that's a power that sadly museums overlook because they have been having this mindset of having to stay neutral and having to, adhere to both parties, when in reality it's like you're telling the story of what, you're telling the story essentially. And it's depending on how you tell this story, how people are going to react to it, And like I said, the biggest issue is you have these people being represented in your museum already. Cubs owners, Cubs players, mob bosses, you feel me? The list goes on. People who made hot dogs, just random little things that are very important and very crucial to Chicago, you feel me? Because trust me, I don't put ketchup on my hot dog, you feel me? But it's like I said, like I would just like to see, oh damn, look, that looks like me, you feel me? Like that's another dude with a Mexican last name or a very Spanish last name, who is like I said, like why couldn't they just do a small exhibition for Joan Sebastian, you feel me? Who is, again, an icon of Mexican regional music. Known, you feel me, all around Mexico, all around south of the border, you feel me? Even in America, you can talk to like all of these immigrant ladies who work in the nail salons, who work in the cleaning salon, who work in the day-to-day basis that makes America run. And they will tell you, oh yeah, we know who that is. But it's like, we don't know that he came from this city. Kids that, like I said in the interview, I have friends who died in the park where he used to sing at. You feel me?
Jared, can I step in and actually sling one of your questions back to our panelists, our other panelists? Yeah. So one of the questions is there's a question about what people see when they go to museums, and there's a question about, how do we prepare people of color to work in museums, and two, how do people of color end up working in museums? And since we have a couple of folks of color here, I'm hoping, I guess we have people working on the education side who are educating future museum people, and we have people who are working inside a museum. So I wonder if maybe Therese, if you want to answer this question about your preparation, maybe for Therese and Lucy, your preparation for students who are thinking about going into the field, how do you prepare them to do the kind of work that Nancy's, doing right now? That answers some of the questions that I think that Jair and Asia are bringing up, which I think are just so sharp and so good. Anyway, that's my.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I think Anthony and Lucy also might have some thoughts about that. Well, I mean, everybody here really. I know I've been working with Anthony. Anthony, when you said you couldn't imagine someone staying in a job for more than however long it was Michael been in his job, you've been in our job. We've been working together that long or longer now.
I said I respect it. I'm impressed by it.
Yeah, but I feel like Anthony and Lucy and I are always trying to figure out exactly the answer to the question that you asked, Ross. What is it that museum workers or cultural workers need to know to actually be ethical, ethical workers in a field that is fraught, as Jair just demonstrated. I mean, just told us how powerful the work of a museum can be. It can set someone up for a really bad day and a really bad feeling about themselves, and as Jair mentioned, some serious emotional consequences, some depression. And so that's serious work, and I think museum workers need to be prepared to take up that serious work. And I don't fully know the answer to it. I feel like we're always trying new things, but I know it's not the canonical museum studies texts that say that museums started in Europe. I know that's not it. So I think what all of us, I think, are doing is trying to introduce our students to theory, critical race theory. We want to read Black feminism. We want to know about gender and women's studies. We start kind of from those bases, and we talk a lot about social justice and social movements. Like, what is it that organizers need to know to make change? It takes a long time to make change, and you can't do it alone. You need community coming together. And, those are a few things that I think about, but I don't feel like I have a definitive answer. I really do feel like I'm always trying it out and trying to get better at doing that job of preparing people to work in institutions that are tough. However, what institutions aren't tough, right? Academia is horrible, as we know. I mean, most jobs are pretty horrible. We're constantly, as workers, having to find a way forward that doesn't devalue us. And it's no different in museums in many ways. So, yeah, so that's one answer. But I'd love to hear Lucy or Anthony or anybody else talk to that.
Yeah, no, I think well said, Therese. I have no answers either. I'm still trying to figure it out. But I think something that you did say held true to one important sort of pedagogical idea I have about teaching museum studies and you said the idea of challenging students to see themselves in the museum field as workers. I think even that in and of itself is a very sort of radical pedagogical act, right? And I think when one sees themselves as a worker, right, as one that's going to imaginably sort of face certain sort of tensions and contestations and certain sort of imbalances of power, I think when one realizes that before one enters a space, it sort of reduces a lot of the element of surprise, I think does a lot of harm. I'm thinking primarily of myself entering in the museum field as sort of a new bushy-tailed curator who wasn't really prepared in terms of the politics of the museum space. I think if I had been trained to think myself as a worker, right, and to think of myself as being part of a collaboration of other workers, right, and that it's through that collaborative that sort of solidarity effort, that change could be made in these spaces. So I think that's one thing that I think is a really important takeaway, is centering sort of social justice and thinking and Marxist philosophy and all of that in a way that's interesting, of course. But,
And can I just add, I think, I know for me, I came into the museum world, sphere, whatever, like on just a happenstance kind of thing. But, I've been asked this question also a lot by, teachers bringing in their students, or now virtually, right? And I think one thing that I always tell people is change doesn't happen until you feel comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? And I think a lot of the, what Jair and Asia were talking about, right, like including those stories or including different people, like that's not going to happen until something gets put out. And if it makes somebody uncomfortable, it's probably because they don't identify with that group, but that's okay, because it's still something for other people. And, you don't make people comfortable with it at all until it's out there, right? It's the same like with students asking questions on our tours, whatever. I say, ask a question, because it's not going to get answered until someone asks it. And somebody also probably has the same question, but we won't ever know because everyone doesn't feel comfortable doing so. But you have to just be uncomfortable in any, area that you're in, and like ride with it and learn from it, because that's the only way that you're going to continue making changes in any area that we're in.
Yeah, and I think for me, I think in addition to a social justice, critical consciousness frame, which the program did, I feel like it, did prepare me, for example, at UIC. I feel like there's a whole lot that I wish I had in my toolbox about change, and how do you lead, how do you make change and organize in a different sort of setting that you wouldn't immediately associate with organizing. That's where I wish, that I had some more tool sets where I'm sort of gravitating towards. What are those strategies? What are those tools so that I can bring about change to something that has roots that are, decades or hundreds of years long.
Well, Nancy, you make, I think you have such an insight into this problem too, because the problem has to be looked at as internally, what do people entering museums do? And then externally, how do communities and students, who museums are often made for children and families, how do children and families challenge it? But then right now, what's happening at the Chicago History Museum is there are staff that are fighting from within, and we helped open that door from fighting from without by students doing it, right? And that unity of working together as community and as people fighting inside to circumvent and challenge colonizing all these institutions are colonizing institutions. They have hierarchical decision-making. We're seeing it right now. Brittany is being challenged, from all the different pressures, and she's trying to navigate it as best she can. But if it wasn't for community and Nancy and Brittany and Ivan and Liliana working together and learning from each other and supporting each other, not that there's some wicked enemy, although maybe there is, but the wicked enemy is just white supremacist institutions baked into the fabric. And so I'd love to hear, Nancy, how you even navigate that right now without saying too much, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's hard. When I started reading the letters, of your students, Anton, about 2 days, I was emotionally like in a totally different place as I was reading about myself in their letters, and thinking about, what are actually some of the influences or privileges at my disposal, right, to make those connections stronger. It's tough, but I want to say that as of last fall, when we started working, with you directly, it really did start feeling like unity scales, moving in the opposite direction. And I I do think it's with coalition building and community building and collective work inside, outside, and even outside of the educational sector, where the change really will happen when we're in bigger numbers.
And teachers have to stop just bringing their students to these places and soaking it in like it's the god and goddesses of knowledge, and critique them. Don't ever take a field trip without critiquing it and then telling the museum, the students, allowing your students to tell the museum their critical thoughts. Why should they go to a museum and never get to tell the museum their critical thoughts? They all have them. Let them speak their critical thoughts every time. Teachers. Sorry.
No, that's great. And I'm sure there's lots more that folks have to say and would love to say. But I want to get to a couple of other questions. And I always like, we've got a really specific question in the chat, and it's someone, asking this brilliant panel for some advice. And so this question comes from CC Carter, who says, I'm in the South and I'm in charge of the largest authentic African art exhibit in Arkansas and the largest African-American Southern art exhibit at my small HBCU. I'm originally from Chicago, working as a teacher and then an administrator in the cultural arts around intersectionalities. But I'm now running into Southern codes of etiquette around race, gender, class, sexuality, and expanding the programs for our exhibits beyond slavery. Any suggestions? And CC Carter also adds, the exhibits are housed on their HBCU campus, and CC has been charged to advance its public awareness to schools, etc., but not be an agitator. And I think you all kind of started this conversation with the specific Chicago context, but I'm hearing this question ask for advice on how to, like we were saying, push for change that communities and people want to see, but the legacies of white supremacy and colonialization and heteronormativity and all of that are hard to break down for a single individual. I already heard some suggestions from Nancy and Anton about the importance of working inside and outside, having community that forms support so that the individuals trying to make change don't feel and are not alone. So can you all maybe offer some suggestions and support for CC Carter?
I'll just say one quick thing. That seems like such a fantastic opportunity. And I think, challenging, of course, but also a really rich opportunity to be working in that specific location in an HBCU. I mean, I think if it were me, I'd get started by asking the school and the students what they want to see. And then maybe the community right around, how would they like to use that space and how would they like to use the objects? It sounds like the collection there looks amazing. And I bet the community will have wonderful ideas, and then they will want to support the implementation of those ideas. And that gives you support, whoever, I guess it's CC who would be doing this, but you would have then the buy-in because it's ideas that are coming from the people right there. So it sounds fantastic. And then maybe also just thinking outside the norm of, exhibit on a wall or something like that. Think of dance, think of performance, some of the ideas that Jair brought in about music. I mean, there may be ways that you can cross categories of cultural creation to just engage people in different ways in that space. It sounds fantastic. I'm jealous.
I would probably say, in addition to what you were mentioning, Therese, to seek input from community advisory groups. We were lucky that Anton and his students came to us, but now, in hindsight, I think about all the moments where we could seek that out too, where we could be the ones initiating those interventions ourselves. And I think since then we have reached out, recently to museum workers working on Indigenous exhibitions who are doing that very thing, helping us look at our exhibits and how a lot of the stories have been omitted, erased, both in the past and in the present. So I think seeking that out would be something that I would sort of tell myself, and just gathering that input and that research, data, evidence, research that comes directly from the voices of the people, whether here it is in the university or in the neighboring communities.
Any other thoughts on that before we move on? I'll just add there are really there's lots of wonderful examples as well that maybe you can reach out to. And I've found that folks who are doing this kind of work, who are trying to push museums to be spaces where social justice can grow and flourish, are usually overworked, but also very generous with their time for other people that want to join them in that work. So folks like the Jane Addams Hull House Museum are like have set examples that have been followed throughout the country and the world, really. So there's probably other folks that, if they're not specifically where you are, you can still form networks beyond your specific geography. There's another question that looks like—
Can I add one more thing?
Oh yeah, sure.
I'm sorry. It took me a while to put my thoughts together. The quick thing I would say in response to CC Carter, I was really taken with the challenge of Southern etiquette. And I'm not from the South, but I went to school in the South. But I think the issues around civility can be very challenging. And oftentimes you're having to think about your job and its viability, and doing so in a way that also doesn't, it confronts, but not in a way that alienates. And I think I always go back to Fred Wilson's Minding the Museum as a perfect example of confronting without having to say much, right? It's by virtue of just using the objects of the museum to speak on the behalf of its history, right? And the history of the exploited, in a way that I think even decenters Wilson so I'm thinking back to Therese and the idea of resisting curation, right? Making it more so a focus on and I would do that even in my class, right? Using a text or a song or a film, and really using that object as sort of a point of sort of direction through which critique can happen, so that, you know, the visitor sort of gets to the critique by themselves, rather than thinking that they're being sort of hit over the head with an ideology. So that might be an example.
That's a great idea. And you're so right. Wilson was just, it's amazing. He used very little text in that exhibit. It just put two objects together that aren't ordinarily put together. And that said everything. And visitors could see it and understand that. That's a great example.
Super fantastic ideas. I hope we have helped a little bit. Another question I really love, this one sort of inspired by some of Lucy's comments. It says, Lucy, in connection to what you said, seeing yourself as a worker in collaboration with other workers in the museum, I'd like to ask all the panelists what they'd put in a new museum workers guide. What would you want them to have? So as I read it, this question is about kind of what would you want someone who is new to working in a museum to know? I see people going back into their own personal histories and biographies.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I will say I have a whole chapter in the book that talks about that, about museums as like sites of labor. And I would say that, first of all, you need to know what an at-will employee is, because I did not know that when I got my first big job and was an at-will employee. And really, how ignorant could you be? But that I didn't know. And I didn't know what that meant. And so I would say people have to understand what that means, and also that you can ask for a contract. Whether you have a union or not, you can say, I would like a different kind of a job description. So being an at-will employee means you can be fired at any time without any notice for basically any legal reason. And you can simply ask to have a different kind of standard. You could ask for 2 weeks notice. You could ask for more. You know, people can make those requests. That can be hard to do, but it's good to know you do have that option. So that's just one thing that comes to my mind that I think everybody should know. Others? Oh, the other thing, everybody should have a union though. And I know that there's been a wave of unionizing across the country. I think I read last year that in the prior year, 40 museums in the US unionized. So that's pretty major, from, coming from a place where most museums were not unionized, except for the kind of the government institutions like the Smithsonian workers are unionized, but most museums were not prior to this previous year. So I would say, you know, start to come together and organize and think about how you can get protected through a union, because that's really the strongest sort of protection any worker has in the US.
I would add to those very important things, which are definitely related to the, navigating the work aspect of it. I think I would add, in terms of navigating the content and the relationship aspect of it, is that be prepared to humbly engage in critical analysis with the people who come to the museum and who aren't coming to the museum that should be coming, and looking at why. So be prepared to be almost to employ dialectical materialism in a way that the Black Panthers spoke of, in terms of analyzing the conditions of the museum and of the communities around the museum, and match those, and be prepared to be challenged and embrace the challenge. Like, if it wasn't for Nancy and Liliana and a few people in the museum embracing the challenge, then I don't think the work would even be at all where it's at, right? But then if it wasn't for the community being just engaged in critical dialogue, it also wouldn't be. So both are so necessary.
Yeah, I think as a museum worker, our own willingness to challenge our own, our own critical consciousness and what we know and don't know about what has happened. And I would even add to that, challenging hierarchy, resisting hierarchical decision making, and really establishing collective decision making, democratic, teamwork, way of working with one another, emphasizing collaboration, building community within the museum. When I feel like sometimes an over professionalization of the field, where you kind of leave yourself when you enter the museum door and you have to bring all of yourself in. And yet the work that has to be done, inside and outside, is relationship building. And then also just challenging and focusing a vision for the common good, not whatever it was back then. Definitely not, the business-centric model, but for collective good, whatever that is. And then everything can emanate from that.
I think for me, as people in general, but especially as museum people or as educators, is when going into this field is celebrating the small successes, right? We want to make change and we want it to happen quick, but it does not happen, right? It takes a while, but there are small steps that we take in order to make that happen. And those small steps are huge in themselves. So I think also taking that time as someone new in the field is knowing that change is going to take a while, whatever a while means to you, but also that there are the small goals that you do reach that you need to take a minute and just celebrate, like, I was able to do X, Y, and Z towards this bigger picture. And I think that's just something that we all need to do in general in life, is like take a second to just celebrate the small things every single day.
Any other suggestions for the guide for our imaginary new museum worker?
Rest. I put rest in there. I don't know if anyone's following the NAT ministry, but they are a big proponent of resting. So I think that should go somewhere. I don't know where that would go in this manual, but it should go somewhere.
Yes, rest, self-care, super important. Literal care is very important. We have an alum from the program who comes back and gives a health and safety workshop for our students. And it made me realize, in all the years I've worked in museums and places like that, no one had ever talked to me about how to safely handle something. And she always tells a story about these well-educated, long-time serving curators who die from touching objects that have poison on them or something like that. You know, like there's real hazards to this work. And I think one of the real hazards is burnout. And I think, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time left. There are some questions for people looking in the Q&A, people looking for suggestions. And if we get to, I don't think we'll have time to get to that. So I would just really strongly recommend folks check out Teresa's book, some of the other books that were mentioned in the opening. There are a number of, I think Ross put a few links to books in the chat earlier. And so maybe just sort of as a way to close out, I would love if everybody on the panel can maybe give us share some of what inspired you, because there was a question about a specific book, The Politics of Public Culture by Ivan Karp from 1992. And someone was asking, was this an inspirational text for anyone else? And so feel free to answer that. But I'd maybe just like to ask everybody, and perhaps we can end with Jair and Aisha. Can you all just share what sort of inspired you to think about museums critically? What was the thing that made you sort of want to look at these institutions with a critical eye?
Me personally, I always wanted to be a paleontologist, right? So what always fascinated me was old things, history and I don't know, things that just had old, had a backstory to it, essentially, dinosaur bones and everything. So I would always go to the Field Museum, which was my favorite museum as a child, and be like, all right, cool. What out of all of these things here, which one would be me? You feel me? Which one looks like me, Which one can I resonate the most? You feel me? And I don't know if that's a feeling of personal identity issues that I had as a child, but I know for sure that would have helped me a lot more, seeing, things that resonated with my culture and specifically that looked like me, and not like somebody who is European descent, you feel me? Because, it would have just made me feel better about who I am as a person, and it would have made me start looking into decolonizing my mind and decolonizing myself at a much earlier age, And I feel like that's what should be the ultimate goal in anything, especially as a museum, is not to try to, change the world, but just to essentially make these, future generations start to question their world at a much younger age, because the younger it starts, the more we can normalize it, And I feel like that's what we should, at the end of the day, be focused on, and that's what really inspired me, was because I was just I wanted to be a paleontologist, but I never heard of a Mexican paleontologist, I've never seen anything like it in any type of museum, you feel me? And I'm just well, where am I supposed to start? You feel me? How am I supposed to start this? I don't have the money. I don't live in the suburbs. My dad isn't here, you feel me? My mom is barely around. How am I supposed to get to this position, And I know if I would have had somebody who looked like me be as a paleontologist, or even as somebody who just knows about the museums, it would have made me want to do or create, just better decisions for myself, and wanting to, decolonize myself, essentially,
Killed it.
Thank you.
Question.
Asia, would you like to tell us what inspired you to look at museums critically?
What inspired me to look at museums critically was it all kind of started in school, when in social studies, we were learning about history, but we weren't always taught, our culture, specifically. And when we went to museums, we didn't really see our culture. We would see European descent cultures and stuff. And the fact that we have a chance now to do that, like I'm really excited to be a part of it, and it gives me an opportunity to, to do more research on it, to learn more about my culture and like who I am really, besides what they've told us that we are and stuff like that.
Thank you so much, Asia. Anyone else want to share what's an early sort of inspiration for approaching museums from a critical perspective?
Well, I really found Jair's words and Asia's words very powerful. And I have to say that I got my own start in museums pretty accidentally. I also lived in a working class town in California where I grew up, and we went on field trips to factories, and because that's where the parents of the kids in my school went, and they never took us to a museum, and I honestly never thought of working in a museum, many years before I thought of that. And I agree that it's so important for museums to make those connections for kids. The schools are already doing too much work. Teachers are doing too much work. The museums need to be reaching out to the schools and building those partnerships so that kids can see that there's a pathway into those places if they find them interesting. Field museums should be reaching out to Jair. He should be there doing what he wants to do in that place, because honestly, it's his museum. It's a public museum on public land, and he's a citizen of this city. He lives in this city. It's his institution. So I wish all museums helped all our children have that feeling, of that connection.
Yeah, I agree with her. Like, I feel like if they give us more of a chance to like express ourselves in the museum, that would make, people want to go. Because kids, like teachers, when they tell them like, oh, we're going to go on a field trip to the museum, nobody really gets excited for it. And maybe if, like they know that, hey, I'm gonna go to the museum and I'm gonna learn a little more about my family or like, my culture and where I came from, they might be excited to actually go to it instead of, oh, this is another field trip here again, or we have to go here. Why can't we go somewhere else? Can't we go to a movie theater or something? They don't want to learn because they learn the same thing in history year after year. And if we make a museum where we can learn something different, I think it's a start to a change. And I think by that, you have more students, engaging, and you have more students not dropping out so much because they're actually learning about themselves versus what they already learned in elementary, and they're just learning it again in high school.
Yeah,
that's it. Drop the mic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to follow that. But I was going to just say that I also did not intentionally get into the museum field either. And I was in high school when, a teacher of mine from middle school in Pilsen said, Nancy, they need a volunteer back at the National Museum of Mexican Art. And I was, a sophomore in high school, wondering why I had to get up Saturday morning. And I fell in love, at that point. I mean, even at the Mexican Museum, we understood that museums are still being seen as elitist places. So even though, I was a Mexican teenager going to the Mexican Museum, I still had formative moments within there working when I would see the reaction of a child going through an exhibition. And for example, when the curator back then made a choice to talk about, the indigenous history and indigenous cultures of Mexico, but chose to put a tortilla press that he took, that it was being used by a woman, in Mexico, and put it next to, a 500-year-old artifact in the same position. And I remember seeing, the child tell his mom they were on a field trip together. And every time I remember it, I get emotional. But he said, Mom, we have that in my kitchen. And the exchange that they made to each other was of value and worth and validation. And it was one of those moments for me when I started to consciously make that decision about the power that we could have and transformational opportunities that we can have as museums if we made those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, man. The Museum of National that museum specifically, that's my favorite museum because I went to the school that is in front of it, Orozco, from first through fourth grade. And I know for a while they would take us to that museum in particular, like once a month as like a little field trip, you feel me? And like I said, like you're right, you know, if we had, I was able to enjoy that part of Pilsen, you know, and that museum in particular because it's still my favorite museum to this day. And it really does, like when I go there, it moves me. It does bring me to tears sometimes, you know, because it gives me nostalgic effects. It also brings me like, it gives me a sense of comfort to be around so much culture that is from a place that is what I would consider home. You feel me? Something where I could be like, damn, these are my people, and these people that look like me and my mom and my dad and my grandfather and my grandparents, you feel me? They all created something and did something to help people like me in the future, you feel me? Like that was their goal. Their goal was to ultimately help the black and brown kids of the future, you know? Cesar Chavez, Frida Kahlo, all of these people, that was their ultimate goal, was to like help and to shape the future children, you feel me?
And
And I feel
museums
that.
can, sorry, Jay,
And
museums can do that beyond exhibitions even.
exactly. Museums are like an amplifier to that, you know. If one person can create that much change, a museum can create, you know, change the world. You feel me? Like, because it's now, it's a, like, you know, like we said, it's an institution, but just because it's an institution doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You feel me? It's an institution of education, you feel me? And we should be able to use that to our advantage and educate the world, you feel me? Not restrict the world, not hold these, you know, precious, you feel me, essentially secrets of knowledge, you feel me, secret, you feel me? Like, this isn't a video game. I shouldn't be having to jump through hoops and ladders to learn about my own culture, you know? Like, I shouldn't have to wait until I go to college to learn about my culture, you feel me? I should be able to learn that straight from the jump, like they did in that school that's across, you feel me? You know, where your first internship was at, you know? Roscoe was a school that actually started to do that very early on, you know, and it taught us a lot about our history. At second grade, I learned both the Pledge of Allegiance and the national anthem to both America and to Mexico, you know, like word for word. And these are just things that like are, you know, insignificant to me when I was then, but now we're just like, damn, like these are things that I feel proud to know, you know, to be able to be like, yeah, I know the national anthem and I can speak fluent English and I can help translate a paisano or an immigrant who doesn't know a lick of English, you know? And these are just things that a museum can incorporate and can use and can like amplify, you know? It's like a superpower.
Can we just redo this whole thing and let you all talk for the entire hour? Like, I don't think any of us can put into words what you all just did. So thank you for that. I mean, yeah, being in the museum as long as I have and other people longer, that was amazing.
Yeah, I want to give a big thank you to all our panelists, and particularly Anton, for helping to bring us Aisha and Jair, and big thanks to both of you for bringing so much power and voice to this conversation.